A tiny Apache girl's grip on a loner's hand stopped a war before it started, turning enemies into allies in Dust Creek's dusty square. Elias Kane's single choice reshaped two worlds forever. How did it come to this? Let's go back to one day earlier, when it all began. If you're watching this on television, take a second to grab your phone and hit follow, like, or share. That one click means a lot, and it helps us keep telling stories that matter. Elias Kane was a loner, the kind of man Dust Creek whispered about, calling him rootless. He lived in a sagging shack on the edge of town, where the desert wind howled through the cracks. His days were filled with hauling timber, mending fences, and avoiding eyes. Nobody knew his story, only that he never laughed. And his hands, tough as leather, told of a life spent working hard and loving little. That morning, he trudged through the market, his boots kicking up dust, when a sharp cry stopped him cold. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the chatter like a blade. He turned and saw her, a small Apache girl, no more than 8, crumpled in the dirt. Her dress was torn, her face smudged with mud and tears. A crowd circled her, not to help but to mock. A man tossed a rotten apple, and it struck her shoulder. She flinched, her small body curling tighter. A boy, maybe 12, pushed through the crowd, his face a mix of bravado and nerves. He gripped a stick, jabbing it toward the girl. "Get out of here!" he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his own boldness. The crowd egged him on, their laughter sharp. Elias's hands clenched at his sides. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over the boy, who froze, the stick trembling in his grip. Elias didn't speak, just stared, his eyes hard but steady, like a man who'd seen too much to be swayed by a child's anger. The boy's face flushed, and he dropped the stick, bolting into the crowd. Elias knelt beside the girl, her eyes locking onto his, wide and desperate, like she was clinging to a lifeline. Her small fingers grabbed his hand, gripping so tight it hurt, and the market fell silent, every eye waiting for his next move. Elias wasn't one for heroics. He'd spent his life dodging trouble, keeping his head down, blending into the shadows of Dust Creek. But something in her grip, in the way her eyes pleaded, held him there. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet, her hand still locked in his. The crowd erupted, their voices a wall of fury. "You touch her, you're done, Kane," a man bellowed, his face red. A woman spat. "She's filth, and you'll be too." Elias looked down at the girl, her trembling frame pressed against his leg, and felt a choice settle over him like a heavy coat. He could walk away, leave her to the crowd, and keep his quiet life. Nobody would care. But her fingers tightened, and he couldn't move. "If you want her gone," he said, his voice low, "you'll have to push me out too." The crowd roared, but he scooped her up, her body light as a sparrow, and walked through the square, their curses trailing him like smoke. As he carried her past the saloon, a group of men lounged outside, their boots propped on barrels, tobacco juice staining the dirt. One smirked, tossing a bottle that shattered near Elias's feet, glass glinting in the sun. He stopped, turning to face them, the girl still in his arms. The men laughed, but their eyes flickered when he stepped closer. "You got something to say?" he asked, his voice calm but heavy, like a storm gathering on the horizon. The leader, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, leaned forward, his grin fading. "You're picking the wrong fight, Kane," he said. Elias held his gaze unflinching until the man looked away, muttering. The others shifted, uneasy. Elias turned and kept walking, the girl's head resting against his chest, her breath warm and steady, a quiet trust that weighed more than any threat. Her name was Nayeli. She didn't talk much at first, just held on to him as they left Dust Creek behind, the trail stretching into the desert. Her arm was bruised where the apple had hit, her breathing shallow but steadying. Elias didn't know where he was headed, only that he couldn't leave her in that square. As the sun climbed, baking the earth, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "My people, they're starving," she said. "The town won't trade with us, no food, no medicine. We're dying." Elias stopped, his boots sinking into the sand. She looked up, her eyes too old for her face. "My grandfather says, if a white man offers his hand, it's a sign. A sign we'll be saved." Elias felt a jolt, like a memory waking up. His mother, dead for years, had been a healer who worked with the Apache, giving everything until it killed her. He'd buried that pain deep, but Nayeli's words dug it up, raw and sharp. Halfway to the camp, a lone rider approached, his horse kicking up dust. He was a trapper, his face weathered, a rifle slung across his back. He reined in, eyeing Nayeli, then Elias. "You're a damn fool, Kane," he said, spitting into the dirt. "Her people will slit your throat the second you turn around." Elias's hand tightened around Nayeli's, but he kept his voice even. "Maybe, but I'm not leaving her to die," the trapper snorted, then reached into his saddlebag, tossing a small sack at Elias's feet. "Dried meat, enough for a couple of days." "You'll need it," he said, his eyes hard but not cruel. He spurred his horse and rode off, leaving Elias staring at the sack, his chest tight with a mix of gratitude and dread, knowing the trapper's gift came with a warning he couldn't ignore. Elias reached the Apache camp by dusk, a scattering of tents and lean-tos tucked in a dry valley, the air heavy with dust and despair. Warriors surrounded them the moment they arrived, their faces carved with suspicion, hands on knives. Elias raised his hands. Nayeli pressed against his side. "I'm not here for trouble," he said, his voice steady. A warrior spat at his feet, his eyes burning. "You're a spy," he growled. Nayeli tried to speak, but a tall man, her grandfather, the chief, stepped forward, his voice sharp. "You think we're fools. You come to pity us, to take something." Elias shook his head, but before he could answer, they grabbed him, tying his wrists with rough rope and shoving him into the camp's center. Nayeli cried out, her voice breaking, but two warriors held her back, her small hands reaching for him. That night, as Elias sat tied to a post, a young warrior, barely more than a boy, slipped through the shadows. He held a knife, its blade catching the firelight, his hands shaking with anger or fear or both. "Why are you here?" he hissed, pressing the blade close to Elias's throat, close enough to sting. Elias didn't move, his eyes locked on the boy's answer. "Because she asked me to stay," he said, nodding toward Nayeli, who watched from a distance, her face pale in the firelight. The warrior's hand wavered, the knife trembling, then he lowered it, his shoulders sagging. "We've been betrayed before," he muttered, his voice thick with pain. He backed away, disappearing into the dark, leaving Elias untouched but rattled, the weight of the camp's scars heavier than the ropes on his wrists. The camp was a picture of desperation. Children shivered with fever, their coughs cutting through the night. Women knelt by fires, whispering prayers, their faces drawn. Old men sat hunched, their eyes empty, hunger etched into their bones. Elias watched, his heart sinking. He'd seen hard times, but this was different, like the whole camp was teetering on the edge of giving up. He thought of his mother, her hands mixing herbs, her voice teaching him which plants could heal. He'd resented her for it, for choosing others over him, for dying and leaving him alone. But now, watching a boy Nayeli's age struggle to breathe, his chest heaving, Elias felt her lessons alive in his hands, urging him to act. He called out to the chief, his voice hoarse but firm. "Let me help that boy." The chief laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the tents. "You? A white man who knows nothing?" Nayeli's voice broke through, small but fierce. "Please, grandfather, let him try." The chief stared at Elias, his eyes searching, then nodded. They cut the ropes, and Elias knelt by the boy, pulling dried mint and seeds from a pouch he'd carried since his mother's death. He crushed them, mixed them with water over a small fire, and dribbled the liquid into the boy's mouth. The camp watched, silent, their doubt thick in the air. Hours later, the boy's fever broke, his breathing slow and steady. His mother gasped, touching his face, her hands trembling. The chief's eyes narrowed, but he stayed quiet. At dawn, the boy's mother approached Elias, her hands clutching a woven blanket, its colors faded but intricate. She didn't speak, just draped it over his shoulders, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Elias tried to hand it back, his voice rough. "I don't need this." She shook her head, her fingers brushing his arm, then turned away, her steps quick. The blanket was heavy, not just with warmth but with meaning, a piece of her family, a gesture of trust. Elias folded it carefully, his hands unsteady, feeling the camp's walls crack just a little, like sunlight breaking through a storm. The chief sat with Elias outside his tent as the sun rose, his face lined with years of grief. "Your hands," he said, his voice low. "They move like hers." Elias frowned, his heart stuttering. "You knew my mother?" The chief nodded. "She saved half this camp during the fever years, risked her life for us." Elias's throat tightened, his mother's face flashing in his mind, her tired smile, her hands stained with herbs. He'd hated her for leaving him, for dying for strangers. Now, he saw her differently. Nayeli crept up, her small hand on his arm. "You're here for a reason," she whispered. "Your mother sent you." Elias wiped his eyes, tears falling for the first time in years, his chest aching with a truth he couldn't deny. A group of women gathered nearby, their hands busy weaving baskets, their voices low but sharp. One, older, with silver streaking her hair, stood and walked to Elias. "You healed one?" she said, her tone hard. "But what about the rest? Will you stay until they're all gone?" Her eyes held fear, not anger, and Elias felt it like a weight. "I'll stay as long as I'm needed," he said, meeting her gaze. She stared, then handed him a small basket of dried roots, herbs she'd gathered herself, her fingers stained with earth. It wasn't trust, not fully, but it was hope, and Elias held the basket like it was gold, his hand steady despite the ache in his chest. The camp was divided. Some warriors wanted Elias gone, calling him a danger, a white man who'd bring ruin. Others, touched by the boy's recovery, saw a flicker of possibility. Then a letter came from Dust Creek, carried by a nervous boy on horseback. It was a warning, scrawled in sharp ink. If the Apache kept Elias, the town would cut off their water supply. Elias faced the chief, his voice low. "If I stay, I'll bring trouble." The chief's eyes were cold, his voice flat. "We don't need your kind of trouble." Nayeli grabbed Elias's hand, her voice trembling but fierce. "If you leave, more will die. Stay." Elias looked at her, then at the camp's weary faces, and felt his mother's memory anchor him. He couldn't walk away. That evening, a scream tore through the camp, a woman clutching her daughter, whose leg was swollen, red, and hot to the touch. Elias ran to them, his hands steady despite the crowd's murmurs. He recognized the infection, something his mother had treated before. He asked for hot water and clean cloth, his voice calm but urgent. The warriors watched, skeptical, but brought what he needed. Elias cleaned the wound, using the last of his mother's herbs, his hands moving with a sureness he didn't feel. The girl whimpered, her mother gripping Elias's arm, her eyes pleading. By morning, the swelling eased, and the girl slept, her face peaceful. The mother fell to her knees, sobbing, and the camp's silence was different now, less hostile, more awed. He went back to Dust Creek alone, his boots heavy on the dirt road. The church was packed, the air thick with anger as the town council met. The mayor stood, his voice booming. "The Apache are a plague. Anyone who helps them is no longer welcome." Elias stepped forward, his mother's old medical tools clinking in his bag. He laid them on the table, a mortar, a pestle, a few vials, worn but sturdy. "My mother saved your kids," he said, his voice steady. "Your wives, your parents. She gave everything for this town and the Apache both." The room fell silent, some faces flushing with shame. They remembered her, even if they'd tried to bury it. A woman in the back stood, her hands trembling, her voice breaking. "My son, he's alive because of her." A man, gray-haired and stooped, nodded. "She stitched me up after a fall. I'd be dead without her." The truth rippled through the room, softening the anger. Elias stood taller. "If you've got any decency left, let the Apache live. They're not your enemy." The council stayed quiet, but the silence wasn't hostile anymore. It was heavy with guilt. Elias walked out, the weight of their eyes different now. No stones thrown, no curses shouted. As he left the church, a young woman, barely out of her teens, darted from the shadows, her hands twisting in her apron. "My brother's with them," she whispered, her voice shaking. "The men planning to hurt the Apache. They're meeting tonight by the old mill." Elias's stomach tightened, her words like a punch. He nodded, his voice soft. "Thank you." She slipped back into the crowd, her footsteps quick. Elias headed toward the camp, his heart pounding, knowing he was walking into a fight he couldn't avoid, the town's worst ready to strike. But not everyone in Dust Creek was swayed. A group of hardliners spread lies, whispering that Elias was tricked, that the Apache would use him and turn on the town. The rumors reached the camp, stirring distrust. "We can't rely on a white man," a warrior said, his voice sharp. Elias didn't argue. He set up a tent outside the camp, spending his days tending sick children, boiling herbs, and hauling water from a dwindling stream. His hands blistered, his back ached, but he kept going. Slowly, the warriors' glares softened, their steps pausing as they passed his tent, watching him work without a word. One evening, a young Apache girl, not Nayeli but close to her age, approached Elias's tent, holding a bowl of thin stew. She set it down without looking at him, her hands quick, then backed away. "Thank you," Elias said, but she was already gone, her shadow blending into the dusk. The stew was watery, barely enough to fill him, but he ate every drop, knowing it was all they could spare. The next day, he saw her watching as he bandaged a child's arm, her eyes curious, not hard. It wasn't trust, but it was something, and Elias felt it like a spark, small but alive. A week later, a storm rolled in, the sky black and rumbling. Lightning cracked, and a tent in the camp caught fire, flames licking at the dry canvas. Elias ran toward it, grabbing a blanket to smother the blaze. Nayeli followed, dragging a bucket of water, her small arms straining under the weight. Warriors joined them, their shouts mixing with the thunder as they fought the fire. When it was out, the camp smoldering but safe, a warrior, the same one who'd held a knife to Elias's throat, clapped his shoulder. His face streaked with ash. "You didn't run," he said, his voice rough but warm. Elias nodded, his throat tight, the smoke still burning his eyes. Then came the night that changed everything. A mob from Dust Creek marched toward the camp, torches blazing, their voices loud with hate. Elias heard them coming and ran to the camp's edge, his heart pounding. He stood alone, unarmed, facing the flickering flames. "You want to burn this place? You'll have to go through me," he shouted, his voice carrying over the wind. The mob hesitated, their torches wavering. Nayeli darted out, grabbing his hand, her small frame trembling but her eyes fierce. She stared at the men, unflinching. The leader raised his torch, but an old man in the mob stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Her mother. She saved me. I can't do this." He dropped his bucket of oil, the liquid soaking into the dirt. One by one, the others followed, their torches hissing out in the night. The camp was silent as the mob retreated, the air heavy with relief. The chief walked to Elias, his hand resting on his shoulder, heavy and warm. "You proved it," he said, his voice low. "Not with guns, not with blood. With this." He touched Elias's chest, over his heart. The warriors bowed their heads, a gesture of respect Elias never thought he'd see. Nayeli hugged him, her face buried in his side, her small body shaking with relief. For the first time, Elias felt like he belonged, like he wasn't just a shadow passing through. The next morning, a group of Apache children gathered around Elias's tent, their eyes bright with curiosity. A boy with a scar on his cheek stepped forward, holding a small wooden horse, its edges rough but carved with care. "For you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elias took it, his fingers tracing the grooves, and nodded. The boy smiled, then ran off, the others trailing behind, their laughter soft in the morning air. Elias held the horse tightly, his throat tight, knowing it was more than a gift. It was a bridge, built by hands too young to know hate. But the land wasn't done with them. A drought came, brutal and unyielding, turning the earth to dust. The camp's wells ran dry, and Dust Creek's fields withered, the crops curling brown under the sun. Elias remembered a story his mother told, a hidden well she'd found years ago, buried under sand and stone. He led a group from the camp and the town to the spot, a barren patch of desert marked only by a pile of rocks. They laughed, shaking their heads. "It's long gone," a man said. Elias didn't answer. He knelt and started digging, his hands clawing at the earth, blood mixing with dirt as he tore through the sand. An old Apache woman joined him, her hands gnarled but strong, her shovel biting into the ground. She didn't speak, just worked beside him, her breath steady. Others followed, warriors, farmers, women, children, until the desert hummed with the sound of digging. A man from Dust Creek, one who'd once cursed Elias, handed him a canteen, his eyes avoiding Elias's. "Keep going," he muttered, his voice gruff. Elias took a sip, the water cool against his cracked lips, and felt something shift, a fragile unity. Born in the dirt, they dug for hours, the sun scorching their backs, their hands raw. Then, a shout, a trickle of water broke through, glinting in the light. It grew, cool and clear, pooling in the earth. Cheers erupted, Apache and townsfolk together, their voices blending in a way nobody could have dreamed. Elias sank to his knees, exhausted, his hands bleeding. Nayeli knelt beside him, her smile brighter than the sun, her small hand still in his. From that well, everything changed. The Apache and Dust Creek began trading again, grain for herbs, tools for blankets. The camp came alive, children laughing instead of coughing. The town rebuilt, its fields green again. The Apache gave Elias a name, keeper of the past's promise. Dust Creek, the town that once shunned him, carved a small stone marker by the well, honoring his mother and him. Elias looked at Nayeli one evening, her hand strong in his. "Your little grip," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "It pulled us all together. That's how it happened. How one man's choice, sparked by a tiny hand, rewrote the story of two peoples. It wasn't about heroics or grand words. It was about showing up, day after day, and choosing to care." If you're watching this on television, take a second to grab your phone and hit follow, like, or share. That one click means a lot, and it helps us keep telling stories that matter.